In the mid-1960s, Emperor Haile Selassie of Ethiopia was widely regarded as one of the most respected international figures of his era. Across Africa, he was celebrated as a father of African unity and a symbol of African independence. In the Caribbean and parts of the Americas, he was revered by some as a divine figure. His role in establishing the Organization of African Unity further enhanced his mystique, solidifying his image as the elder statesman of Africa. Yet beneath this global admiration, deep political tensions were taking shape, tensions that would ultimately contribute to the collapse of his rule in 1974. Haile Selassie's political career had been defined by constant maneuvering. Since 1916, when he became regent plenipotentiary under Empress Zewditu, he had navigated competing domestic factions, colonial pressures, and shifting international alliances to emerge as the undisputed ruler of Ethiopia. While he commanded immense respect abroad, within Ethiopia and across the African continent, mounting pressures, economic strain, regional insurgencies, and geopolitical rivalries were steadily eroding the foundations of his power. Most accounts of Selassie's downfall focus on the student-led protests and the military coup that ended the Solomonic dynasty. However, these internal factors alone do not fully explain the emperor's vulnerability. Equally important were the gradual unraveling of Ethiopia's security apparatus, the deterioration of Selassie's standing among African leaders, and his growing isolation on the international stage. Central to this story is one of his most formidable adversaries, Myanmar Gaddafi of Libya. To understand how Gaddafi came to see Selassie as a rival and ultimately work to undermine him, it is necessary to examine Ethiopia's complex relationship with the Middle East and Israel, against which this conflict unfolded. Key turning point in this broader regional struggle came with the Suez Crisis of 1956. When Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, Britain and France, working in secret with Israel, launched a military intervention to regain control. Although the operation succeeded militarily, it collapsed politically under pressure from both the United States and the Soviet Union. Britain, France, and Israel were forced to withdraw, while Egypt retained control of the canal. Despite suffering battlefield losses, Nasser emerged as the symbolic victor, elevated across the Arab world and the global South as a champion of anti-imperialism. The crisis marked the decline of European colonial dominance in the region and accelerated the spread of revolutionary Arab nationalism. Although the Suez Crisis had no direct military impact on Ethiopia, Haile Selassie viewed its aftermath with deep concern. Nasser's rhetoric targeted monarchies, elites, and regimes he characterized as agents of imperialism. More troubling for the emperor was Nasser's insistence that the Horn of Africa itself was part of the broader Arab revolutionary struggle. Within Selassie's inner circle, it was well understood that he suffered from what historians have called the Ahmad Gran syndrome. Ahmad ibn Ibrahim al-Ghazi, known as Ahmad Gran, was a 16th-century imam who nearly destroyed the Ethiopian Christian empire. Born in the Adal Sultanate, which encompassed parts of present-day eastern Ethiopia and Somalia, Ahmad Gran launched a campaign in 1529 that overran much of Abyssinia. By unifying Muslim forces across the Horn of Africa, he brought the Ethiopian empire to the brink of collapse. For Haile Selassie, this historical memory was not distant. It was a warning. In Gamal Abdel Nasser, Selassie saw a modern incarnation of that same threat. A leader capable of mobilizing Muslim populations within Ethiopia and across its borders. At the same time, Ethiopia was engaged in negotiations with the United Nations over Eritrea, a process that fueled resentment, particularly among Muslim Eritreans. Many Eritreans fled to Cairo, where they studied at Al-Azhar University. Hundreds reportedly received scholarships and stipends from the Egyptian government. Alongside religious education, they were exposed to revolutionary Arab nationalism and anti-Ethiopian narratives that portrayed Haile Selassie as an agent of Israel and an enemy of Islam. It was in Cairo where the Eritrean Liberation Front, ELF, would be organized by Idris Muhammad Adam, former president of the Eritrean Assembly. Adam fled to Cairo when pressured by the Ethiopian government to abandon his ambitions for Eritrean autonomy. In Egypt, he would receive support from Gamal Nasser. Nasser continued his support up to 1963, following the formation of the OAU, after which Nasser expelled the ELF leaders to Damascus. By the late 1950s, Nasser's ideology had transformed the Middle East. His influence contributed to the overthrow of the Hashemite monarchy in Iraq in 1958 and destabilized regimes in Lebanon and Jordan. For Selassie, these developments reinforced the fear that Muslim populations in the Horn of Africa, echoing the era of Ahmad Gran, were becoming increasingly radicalized and aligning their grievances with a wider Arab struggle. Amid these anxieties, Haile Selassie quietly moved toward closer cooperation with Israel. Both states shared a sense of strategic vulnerability in a hostile regional environment. In February 1957, Ethiopian representatives approached Yosef Namias, a Mossad agent operating in Europe, to establish secret lines of communication. Israel understood that any relationship with Ethiopia would have to remain discreet, as Selassie still depended on Arab support in international forums, particularly regarding Eritrea. Parallel channels were also pursued. Selassie engaged Israeli businessman Azriel Einav, who operated the Enkoda Meat Company in Asmara, to facilitate contact with Israeli intelligence. Shortly thereafter, Mossad director Isser Harel traveled to Ethiopia to meet the emperor personally. Over the following years, Israeli military and intelligence officials assisted in training Ethiopia's police, armed forces, and imperial bodyguard. Among these groups was then Chief of Military Intelligence, Yehoshaphat Harkabi. It was clear Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion viewed Selassie as a crucial ally in countering Soviet-backed Arab nationalism in the Horn of Africa, and therefore sent Israel's top advisors to ensure Ethiopia's internal security. By the mid-1960s, Israel had cultivated extensive ties across Africa. Newly independent states benefited from Israeli technical assistance in agriculture, medicine, and security. Leaders such as Kwame Nkrumah maintained economic partnerships with Israeli firms contributing to the Black Star Line Shipping Company, Ghana's Construction and Builders Brigade, while countries like Uganda received military and infrastructural support. Yet these relationships would not endure. As Arab-Israeli tensions intensified after the Six-Day War of 1967, Israel's growing footprint in Africa increasingly became a source of controversy. The emperor hoped that the relationships he cultivated with Gamal Abdel Nasser and other Arab leaders within Africa, particularly following the formation of the OAU, would help restrain the growing strength of Eritrean and Somali forces hostile to Ethiopia over long-standing border disputes. Yet Nasser himself remained deeply suspicious of Haile Selassie. During the 1964 OAU summit in Cairo, the emperor was approached by Nasser alongside Ahmed Ben Bella, Prime Minister of Algeria, and urged to cease cooperation with Israel. Should Ethiopia refuse, they warned, Arab support for Somali forces would be increased. By the late 1960s, however, the political landscape of both Africa and the Middle East was shifting. Nasser's regional influence had begun to wane in the aftermath of Egypt's costly intervention in Yemen's civil war, and the devastating defeat suffered during the Six-Day War with Israel in 1967. In September 1969, a new and more radical figure emerged, Myanmar Gaddafi, who seized power in Libya. Gaddafi's overthrow of Idris of the Senussi monarchy and immediately nationalizing Libya's oil assets positioned him to finance his revolutionary ideals. Shortly after his rise, Gaddafi authorized the opening of a Libyan office of the Eritrean Liberation Front. The following year, in May 1970, he went further, declaring a holy war against what he described as the Christian regime of Haile Selassie. In doing so, Gaddafi effectively replaced Nasser as the principal antagonist confronting the Ethiopian emperor. An admirer of Nasser and a committed believer in pan-Arabism, Gaddafi would carry this ideology forward with even greater militancy. The ELF, apart from being supported with arms and training from Syria and Iraq, were now also being aided by Gaddafi. The Eritrean separatists by 1969 were engulfed in rebellions and guerrilla tactics resulting in martial law in 1970. The prior year, the ELF began targeting Ethiopian airlines, with the first hijacking of an Ethiopian airplane on September 13, 1969.
Due to the presence of the Organization of African Unity, which has its headquarters in Addis Ababa, and which does not support our case due to the Ethiopian influence. And so we have to make our case known. And by hijacking Ethiopian planes, we really made a good job this year. And so we are here also to ask us about what is going on in Eritrea, because you heard about Eritrea. It's only to make the case known.
With the situation worsening in Eritrea, Emperor Haile Selassie began seeking help from Arabs in the region, hoping their influence would help circumvent the attacks on Ethiopia. In May 1970, Haile Selassie, at the invitation of Nasser, met in Cairo with Nasser. Hoping to address the Eritrean situation, a meeting was held with the Deputy Prime Minister of Sudan and Libya's ambassador to Egypt. Libya's ambassador made it clear to the emperor that he was authorized to tell him that any friends of Israel was considered an enemy to Libya. According to historian Haggai Ehrlich, Libya's Myanmar Gaddafi was driven in part by ambitions to dominate the African political arena, an aspiration that brought him into direct conflict with Haile Selassie. Further, Israel's occupation of the Sinai following the Six-Day War became a focal issue within African diplomacy. At OAU and non-aligned movement meetings, North African leaders framed Israel's actions as a form of colonial occupation of African land. Gradually, this argument began to sway opinion within the organization, placing Selassie in an increasingly precarious position. The death of Gamal Abdel Nasser in September 1970 initially offered Selassie hope. His successor, Anwar Sadat, appeared more pragmatic and less committed to pan-Arab confrontation. Selassie believed Sadat might help mediate Ethiopia's conflicts in Eritrea and Somalia. However, Egyptian-Israeli relations deteriorated further, and pressure mounted on Ethiopia to distance itself from Israel. Even while voting consistently in favor of Palestinian positions at the United Nations and publicly condemning Israel's occupation of Arab territories, Selassie tried to preserve discreet security ties. Unlike Nasser, Sadat was willing to negotiate with Israel, and Haile Selassie actively sought to facilitate a settlement. Yet Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir remained unwilling to compromise on terms acceptable to Egypt. By 1973, African leaders, particularly from North Africa, were openly frustrated. Israel's continued occupation of the Sinai was increasingly defined as an African issue, and Ethiopia's relationship with Israel was viewed as an obstacle to continental unity. At the same time, Ethiopia's internal situation was deteriorating. Eritrean insurgency intensified, Somali hostility persisted, and American military assistance fell short of Ethiopia's needs. Israel remained one of the few reliable security partners available to Selassie, deepening his diplomatic isolation. Muammar Gaddafi exploited this vulnerability. In 1973, Libya escalated its support for the Eritrean Liberation Front, facilitating arms transfers and financial assistance through Somali and Palestinian networks. Following a meeting between Gaddafi and ELF spokesman Osman Saleh Sabeh, May 10, 1973, the ELF, now influenced by Marxist ideology and Palestinian guerrilla tactics, received from Gaddafi significant shipments of weapons and millions of dollars in funding. Gaddafi was positioning himself as the leading Arab patron of armed struggle against Ethiopia. In April 1973, Muammar Gaddafi began accusing the emperor of hosting the Zionist enemy with its espionage bases in Africa, and threatened to push for the removal of the OAU headquarters from Addis Ababa to Cairo. Gaddafi continued his attacks on May 13, 1973, followed with a telegram to Emperor Haile Selassie, threatening to boycott the upcoming 10th anniversary of the OAU, which was to be held in Ethiopia. The Ethiopian government responded, stating that their relations with Israel has never prevented Ethiopia from fully cooperating with all Arab states. Gaddafi's threat to push for the removal of the OAU headquarters from Ethiopia was a serious concern. Other African leaders, including President Gowon of Nigeria and Mobutu Sese Seko of Zaire, had already expressed interest in hosting the organization's headquarters in their own countries. Fearing that Gaddafi's attacks might sway African leaders to turn against Ethiopia, Emperor Haile Selassie traveled to Cairo to meet with Anwar al-Sadat. During the meeting, the emperor presented reports from Ethiopia's foreign ministry addressing claims of an Israeli presence in the country. He sought to reassure Sadat that Israel did not maintain a military base in Ethiopia and went further, inviting Egypt's Minister of War to visit Ethiopia and inspect any location he wished. Despite Gaddafi's continued provocations, Sadat assured the emperor that he would attend the upcoming 10th anniversary of the OAU. Sadat also promised that, during the commemoration, he would directly confront Gaddafi over his attacks towards the emperor. Following the festivities of the 10th anniversary of the OAU, the members met on May 27th through 29th, 1973, during which Libya continued its smear campaign against Haile Selassie. Although Gaddafi, along with Siad Barre of Somalia and King Hassan of Morocco, were absent, Gaddafi's proposal was still presented to the OAU members. Libya's Minister of Information, Abu Dorda, in his speech to the African leaders, accused Ethiopia of hosting Zionist espionage bases and collaborating with Western powers to undermine African liberation movements, and also pushed for the removal of the OAU headquarters from Addis Ababa. Tensions were high as Dr. Minister Menes Haile went to the podium to address Libya's onslaught of vitriol towards Ethiopia. Dorda's attacks were broadcast on Ethiopian television, and was the first Ethiopians were seeing defiance against their emperor.
To the very eminent men in this conference room, and I regret that the occasion arose for me to exercise the right of reply of my delegation in connection with the insults that has been heaped by the representative of Libya upon my government and people. Mr. Chairman, I am not here to respond to his proposal that this organization be moved to another headquarters, to another city. That's up to us, up to the Assembly of Heads of State and Governments, who, through a unanimous decision, have made the decision to locate this organization in Addis Ababa. There are some things which the government of Libya must understand. Africa is not for sale. We are independent from sovereign states. Africans are jealous of their independence and sovereignty. No matter how wealthy Libya is, that means nothing for us, and you cannot buy. There is no head of state. There is no representative of an African government in this room that's prepared to accept dictation from Libya. You better learn that. The philosophy of Libya is cultural and linguistic chauvinism. It is religious fanaticism. It's arrogance above all. Arrogance.
The African leaders, however, voted against Gaddafi's proposal, spending the remaining days of the conference discussing their dissatisfaction with Israel's occupation of the Sinai. Frustrated by Israel's refusal to withdraw from the Sinai, Anwar al-Sadat of Egypt and Algeria's Houari Boumediene, possibly encouraged by Muammar Gaddafi, pushed for a resolution calling on African states to sever diplomatic ties with Israel. As early as 1972, Ugandan leader Idi Amin became the first African head of state to break relations with Israel, reportedly after being promised financial support from Gaddafi. Emperor Haile Selassie initially opposed the idea of immediately severing ties. However, he made it clear that if Israel continued to occupy the Sinai and avoided meaningful peace negotiations, he would support such sanctions. Although the resolution was not adopted at the 10th OAU summit, a drafting committee was formed, consisting of Ethiopia, Niger, Botswana, Zaire, and Tanzania. The committee strongly condemned Israel for its aggression and continued occupation of the Sinai. While diplomatic ties were not cut immediately, events in the months that followed would trigger an unprecedented wave of decisions, leading more than 20 African countries to sever relations with Israel. The Yom Kippur War broke out on October 6, 1973, when Egypt and Syria launched a coordinated surprise attack against Israel on Judaism's holiest day, Yom Kippur. Egyptian forces crossed the Suez Canal into the Sinai Peninsula, while Syrian troops advanced into the Israeli-occupied Golan Heights. The offensive was carefully planned to reclaim territories lost to Israel during the Six-Day War of 1967. In the early days of the conflict, Egypt and Syria achieved significant gains, catching Israel off guard and temporarily reversing the balance of power in the region. Egyptian forces successfully breached Israel's defensive Bar-Lev line along the Suez Canal, restoring Arab confidence after years of military and political humiliation. However, Israel quickly mobilized its reserves and launched counteroffensives on both fronts. Within weeks, Israeli forces pushed Syrian troops back from the Golan Heights and crossed the Suez Canal, encircling Egypt's Third Army. Although Israel ultimately gained the military upper hand, the war exposed its vulnerability and shattered the perception of Israeli invincibility. Following the outbreak of the Yom Kippur War, Africa's relationship with Israel reached a breaking point. Immediately, Haile Selassie publicly declared Ethiopia's opposition to the acquisition of territory by force and called for the implementation of UN Resolution 242. Internally, the emperor commissioned Foreign Minister Menas Haile as head of a high-level committee to review Israel's role in Ethiopia's security apparatus. Despite warnings from military leaders that severing ties would weaken Ethiopia's defenses, diplomatic pressure from Arab states proved decisive. On October 19th, Sadat cabled the emperor for the fourth time since the outbreak of the war. His message was blunt: no more talking between us. Do what you have to do. Do not just talk. Following Sadat's message, the emperor convened a meeting at his residence outside Addis Ababa. Prime Minister Aklilu presided over the session and proposed the immediate severing of diplomatic ties with Israel. All ministers agreed except Ketema Yifru and Endelkachau Makonnen. Ketema Yifru strongly objected, warning the cabinet of the consequences. It seems to me that we are planning to break off diplomatic relations with Israel in order to please the Arabs and win their friendship. However, I doubt that we will be able to win the friendship of the Arabs no matter what we do. The Arabs will not change the hatred they have for us, nor their policies. They will not halt the aid they are giving the Eritrean secessionists. It is best that we not deceive ourselves in this respect. Ketema Yifru's warning proved to be somewhat prophetic. In the lead-up to 1973, Sadat arranged a meeting between the emperor and King Faisal of Saudi Arabia as part of Haile Selassie's efforts to secure stronger relations with Arab states in the region. King Faisal, however, was deeply invested in Ethiopia's relationship with Israel and hoped the emperor would sever those ties. In an effort to persuade Haile Selassie, King Faisal was reportedly prepared to offer Ethiopia up to $200 million in military aid and development assistance in exchange for breaking relations with Israel. As it became clear that there was no peaceful resolution in sight for the Suez crisis, and in line with the OAU's stance against the occupation of African territory, events moved swiftly. On October 23, 1973, Ethiopia severed diplomatic relations with Israel, joining more than 20 African nations in doing so. The decision failed to bring the promised relief. Support for Eritrean rebels continued. Ethiopia's strategic position worsened, and within a year, Haile Selassie was overthrown by the Derg, bringing an end to a dynasty that had ruled for millennia. In the aftermath, Myanmar Gaddafi cultivated close ties with the new military regime, embracing its revolutionary rhetoric. In later decades, he would seek to occupy the continental role once held by Haile Selassie, first as a revolutionary patron, later as a self-styled king of kings of Africa. The rivalry between the two men reveals a deeper truth about the era. In a rapidly changing Africa, ideology, religion, and geopolitics converged to undo even the most seasoned of rulers.